Coming up on The Daily, football is returning to the Middle East in 2034. But why does Saudi Arabia even want to host the World Cup? Back in a moment. Hi everyone, Niall Paterson here with The Daily, and now we know it is Saudi Arabia who's going to be hosting the 2034 World Cup. Yes, there's a lot to be done between now and then, but the Saudis aren't holding back. 15 brand new stadiums are proposed, all futuristic lines and neon lights, including one perched on a cliff 350 metres above ground. Pity the ball boys. Yes, this isn't the first time a Gulf state has hosted. Qatar held it back in 2022, but much of the criticism of that decision, Qatar's human rights record mostly, is now being applied to Saudi Arabia. No doubt a spotlight is being held up. So what's in it for the Saudis? Here's our sports correspondent Rob Harris. Rob, so how did the Saudis succeed in their bid, albeit unchallenged?
Quite simply by flattering and funding FIFA. They've managed to work this process to great strategic success, ensuring there is no contested bidding competition at all, and they're being handed this World Cup.
Yeah, explain exactly how that has happened.
So in the past, we might remember the years of lobbying and campaigning, which became embroiled often in vote-buying allegations too, as countries fought it out to host the World Cup. Instead, FIFA has managed to engineer a process to ensure there was only one contender. Now, on the face of it, there is a democratic process, as they would put it. They did open up the bids to any country, as long as you were from Asia or the Oceania region.
Why specifically those two regions? I thought this would have been open to the world.
Well, there are regulations that the World Cup can't be held consecutively in the same continent. So how did they knock out many of the other bidders? What they did is they lumped various contenders together for the 2030 World Cup. So also today was approved the absolutely ambitiously mega plan for 2030, 3 continents, 6 countries staging the 2030 World Cup.
Run us through this, just step by step. Who on earth is hosting in 2030 that means Saudi Arabia have just been gifted this?
So South America are knocked out because they're going to have the opening matches in Argentina, Uruguay and Paraguay. Then the bulk of the tournament will be staged in Morocco, Spain and Portugal. So therefore, there could be no European, African or South American contender for 34.
Well, let's just, again, dwell on the process. How does any country get to the point of hosting a World Cup? Who decides?
Well, nominally, it's all 211 FIFA associations. That was a reform introduced by Gianni Infantino at the start of his presidency after being swept to power in 2016 after the wave of scandals that really stemmed from the awarding of the Russia and Qatar World Cups. This time there was no vote. It was merely by acclamation because they weren't presented with rival candidates. Now, FIFA clearly worked a system to prevent there being a rival candidate, is the accusation. It only gave rival contenders several weeks to enter the race, and that was too short a time frame for Australia, for instance, which just couldn't get the support it would need domestically from the government to be able to say it could submit a bid.
So, for all that Gianni Infantino and others within FIFA say the house has been put in order, I'm looking at this process and it doesn't look particularly fair to me.
There've been a lot of questions over Gianni Infantino's excessively close relationship to Saudi Arabia and Mohammed bin Salman. In early 2021, when the world and FIFA as well were telling people to avoid non-essential travel during the height of pandemic restrictions, he went out to Saudi Arabia and was filmed in a Saudi promotional PR video extolling the virtues of the country. Now, of course, it makes sense to embrace countries that are investing in football and developing nations in terms of the sport, you know, particularly as Saudi Arabia is trying to take on those established countries like England, France and Spain. So you could see why Gianni Infantino would have a legitimate duty to be there. The question is, was he overly close to them, which basically put off any rival bids?
Rob, does FIFA care, genuinely, about what any of us think about where the World Cup ends up? Because it doesn't look like it.
Well, certainly from Gianni Infantino, despite being Swiss-Italian, he's very much led this sort of charge around the world saying Europe dominates too much of the wealth of the game is in Europe, the leagues are too powerful, and he's about making the sport global, presenting himself very much as an anti-European.
And indeed, Saudi Arabia, we have to say, has invested in sport more generally. The golf as well, of course, there's the tennis, the snooker, and football as well. So doesn't the investment in and of itself justify a nation like Saudi Arabia getting a competition like this?
There are many sports crying out for investment.
Yeah.
We just have to look at, say, rugby in the UK, which is struggling. So actually, sports have been saved in many ways by Saudi investment. I mean, golf is obviously one of the big ones. They launched this Rebel Live series effectively to force the PGA Tour and others to the table to negotiate a merger. In boxing, some of the biggest bouts are now held in Saudi Arabia, offering huge purses for the fighters. Even when there was a fight here at Wembley earlier this year, it was under the Saudi flag. The Saudi national anthem was played.
OK, look, let's go back to the future, 2034, 10 years away. What do we know about what this tournament will look like in Saudi Arabia? I mean, is it taking place in the summer?
Well, we're obviously used to the World Cup being in June and July, apart from when it was Qatar and it had to be November, December because of the heat. There is no fanciful pledges to stage it in June, July. They've set out the various parameters, which do really point to a January, February World Cup in 2034 because of the dates of Ramadan and the Hajj. And it certainly wasn't the end of football just because the World Cup had to be in November and December in 2022, despite the disruption. But the big thing is they're going to have to build so much for this World Cup, 15 stadiums, all the infrastructure, which brings with it a lot of risk.
I've seen some of the promotional videos emerging from the Saudi bid. I mean, no matter what happens, if they can get it all built, it is going to look stunning. And they know a thing or two about building in Saudi Arabia, don't they?
This World Cup will transform Saudi Arabia. The question is, will it transform its image? And for rights groups, that's why they're spending all this. It's to rehabilitate the image of a country that's been beset by human rights concerns, and also to set itself onto a sort of new path, perhaps beyond oil as well. But these 15 stadiums that they are building, Saudi Arabia insists are necessary for football in the country, which is growing. And some of them are absolutely audaciously ambitious. The Neon project being built in a mega city in the desert.
Oh, this is the thing that looks essentially like a big shiny wall through the desert.
I mean, it's still very hard to comprehend the images that have been created of this, the visualizations, and whether it actually comes to fruition. But there's futuristic stadium and all these other stadiums being built on cliff edges, and it is a vast enterprise, also very lucrative, often for European firms who are the designers, the engineers, and those who are often tasked with building them.
Thank you, Rob. More on the Saudi ambitions for 2034 in just a moment. OK, so we know how the World Cup was won, but for what purpose? Previous Saudi investment in professional sport has been branded sports washing, the idea you can clean your country's tarnished reputation by sponsoring big-name teams or events. James M Dorsey is a former journalist turned academic who's written The Turbulent World of Middle East Soccer. A two-time Pulitzer Prize nominee, he knows an awful lot about why the Gulf is increasingly turning its attention to the world of football. James, so to what extent is this Saudi bid motivated by sports washing?
No, it actually is not. In fact, the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, in an interview earlier this year, was very explicit that he could not care less about reputational issues, which is what sports washing refers to, the notion of trying to polish an image tarnished primarily by human rights abuses. When Mohammed bin Salman spoke about his lack of concern about reputation, what he said was what he cares about is that sports will contribute about 1.5% to Saudi Arabia's domestic product. And that's important because bin Salman has launched a Vision 2030, which is a program that is designed to wean Saudi Arabia away from dependence on oil exports, diversify its economy, and make it a 21st century cutting-edge knowledge state. Sports is important in terms of developing one sector of the economy. It's important for public health reasons. Saudi Arabia is one of the countries with the highest rate of diabetes in the world. And of course, sports is also an industry that feeds into the leisure industry, the entertainment industry, and tourism. Ultimately, of course, a successful World Cup improves Saudi Arabia's reputation and prestige. The reason why I don't use the term sports washing is because that implies that the reputational issues are the driving motive. I don't think they are.
What's your view then, James, of the process, the decision-making process that has led to Saudi Arabia getting its hands on the World Cup in 34?
As far as I'm concerned, it is totally corrupt. Since 2010, when Qatar was awarded the World Cup, FIFA has been engaged in a number of scandals, has introduced reforms, on top of which human rights was a major issue in the criticism of the awarding of the World Cup to Qatar. And as a result of all of that, FIFA has adopted what amounts to a human rights charter to which countries have to conform if they want to qualify as hosts of the tournament. Saudi Arabia does not qualify according to FIFA's own human rights guidelines by any stretch of the imagination.
I imagine there would be those at FIFA who say, like with Qatar, allowing a nation like Saudi Arabia to host the World Cup shines a spotlight on its human rights record and could potentially lead to change.
There are very few cases where FIFA or proponents of a certain World Cup host have made that argument, and that argument has proven to be correct. In fact, Qatar made the only exception, and the pressure that was exerted on Qatar worked. The difference between Qatar and Saudi Arabia is that this was in Qatar's interest. Qatar wanted to be seen to improving its record. Saudi Arabia is a very different ballgame. I quoted the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman earlier saying that he could not care less about the criticism of Saudi Arabia. He's not going to be pressured. And of course, he has a track record. He knows that he can survive these kind of criticism. He was essentially a pariah for several years because of the 2018 brutal killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. And it took a couple of years, and he's back, a prominent international player, welcome wherever that may be. So the notion that Saudi Arabia is going to be pressured into improving its human rights situation, I think is pie in the sky. I also think we need to keep something else in mind, and that is that it's politicians with agendas, it's journalists, it's human rights activists, who by and large are the ones who care about the human rights aspects of a World Cup host. The majority of football federations do not. The majority of fans do not. You saw that in 2022 with Qatar, which had some record numbers in terms of fans attending the World Cup. Granted, the demography of the fans coming to Qatar was a different demography. Those Europeans who stayed away from Qatar did so not primarily because of workers' rights or LGBTQ rights, but because it was an expensive World Cup.
What of more practical concerns then, James? I mean, World Cups are generally held in the summer months. After Qatar, this will be the second time a Gulf nation is hosted and will have had to transfer it to what the Northern Hemisphere would consider the winter months.
To be honest, I have no empathy for that argument. It's a Eurocentric view of the world. Fact of the matter is that the Northern Hemisphere had 12 years to prepare for a World Cup that was going to be held in the winter rather than in the summer months. Strikes me that's more than enough time to adjust.
Where do you see Middle Eastern football being by the time of the 2034 World Cup?
Look, the Middle East is home to a number of football powerhouses. Think of Saudi Arabia, think of Egypt, think of Tunisia, think of Morocco, think of Algeria. So in and of itself, this is a part of the world with a very bright football future. Qatar pulled off a phenomenal World Cup. better than many had expected. And so I think, discounting for one moment the political problems that ravage the region at this moment, the future of football regionally is a very bright future.
James, thank you. That is your lot for this edition of The Daily. We are back again, same time tomorrow. See you then.